Welcome everyone to a new episode of the Haptics Club podcast. I'm Manu from Unity, and I'm joined by the trusty Haptics crew, Ashley from Interhaptics, Xara from Interhaptics, and Gijs and Irina from Senseglove. I'm joined by the authors behind the XR Haptics design and implementation guidelines book, so including Eric from Interhaptics, Chris Ullrich, CTO of Immersion, Gijs from Senseglove, and Rafael from Actronika. The Haptics Club is a team of people that have a passion for haptics, and our goal is to raise awareness on the amazing tech and people in haptics and to foster interesting discussion on the subject. So we are so happy to have been able to contribute to this space together for season 2 of the Haptics Club with even more surprises and new exciting guests. So there's much to learn and talk about. So we'll start off this chat as we do with some questions to get to know our guests. And then we'll dive deeper into their expertise and of course include some questions on the challenges and opportunities in the haptics industry from their perspective. Timing-wise, we'll divide the hour with a 5-minute intro, then 15 minutes on area of expertise and 10 minutes on the future of haptics. At the 30-minute mark, we stop the recording and open up the floor for the audience to ask our guest questions. So be ready. To anyone listening to the podcast, you're missing out. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Haptics Club and sign up for our newsletter that's linked so you don't miss the next live chat. With that, let's talk haptics. Ashley, back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Manu. So we have a kind of a full house here today, which is awesome. We've got a panel of folks so excited to chat about this book launch. But let's get it started, of course, by talking more about who you are and kind of what you do, where you're from, and we'll just give kind of like a quick pitch on that. So how about Chris, kick us off with that?
Sure, thanks, Ashley. So I'm Chris Ullrich. I'm the CTO at Immersion Corporation. I'm sure everyone knows that company. I started in haptics in 1998, something like that. 1998, working on Cyber Grasp system, which is a historical, I guess, VR product in haptics, doing collision detection, interaction, force feedback, hybrid control, a whole bunch of hard problems, of course. I think we had 70 degrees of freedom in that system, so it was all sorts of fun. And then I did a bunch of work in surgical simulation with haptics, robotic end effectors, all this kind of stuff. And then more recently, I've done the stuff that Immersion does, which is mobile phones, auto, game controllers, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm happy to talk to the book. I think it's a great achievement from HIF, and I'm happy to have worked with my co-authors, and so I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Rafael.
Hi, thank you for the invitation. I'm Rafal Pijewsky, CTO of Actronika, one of the co-founders. My story with haptics started, as some of you as well, by knowing Vincent Hayward, working with him in his research team as an engineer. At some point, we started talking with Vincent about making the actuator he developed available to broader audience. So that's how Actronika was founded, around the actuator. But eventually, we realized that the more potential is in the software you propose to control these actuators. So that's where we actually started working on all the, let's say, aspects of haptics, so the actuators, but then the control, the hardware. As a company, we moved quickly at the beginning into automotive market because there was a huge traction. But then through the let's say through the COVID and some other factors, we actually we tried to reinvent the company, and we realized that VR is the space to go for. And today we will be so I have had the pleasure to collaborate with co-authors. I was not to do the heavy lifting on this one, to be honest, but yeah, this was a great experience, and I think this book is bringing a lot of ideas that can be reused in all the future implementation of haptics into XR. So yeah, happy to be here.
Super exciting. Love that. It's a great story. Now, folks know you guys, but let's give intros as well. Eric, let's start with you.
I'll be brief. So I'm Eric Vezzoli. I'm CEO of Interhaptics, kind of CTO, so I do both. And I'm leading the XR Haptics working group at HIF that trying to document best practices, and this is the objective of this book. We'll just talk about it later. Been in haptics since I think 2013 with the PhD, not with Vincent this time, with someone else. That's fun. And I was doing surface haptics, so spatial haptics since that time, facing an interesting problem on how to put haptics in space. So that's why Xara makes sense. And happy to be here and happy to share some thoughts.
Last but certainly not least.
Yeah, also thanks for the invitation. Gijs, one of the co-founders of Senseglove, and the easiest explanation is to say, since Chris is here also on the call, we're doing cybergrass things, but then wearable and a few years later. So we make force feedback gloves for virtual reality, mostly focused on enterprise training at the moment. And we try to always make things wearable, so our gloves work also with all standalone headsets in XR. And yeah, my background in haptics is quite short. I come from a human-computer interaction background where I did my studies in, and from my thesis, the whole virtual reality wave came up, and I missed a real-life interaction inside this 3D domain of computing, and that's the reason of existence of Senseglove today, and especially working from computer interaction towards virtual reality and towards haptics. I've done a lot of implementations also as project manager of haptics in XR, especially with our Senseglove. And I try to bring in that experience into this book and to help other project managers to actually do sensible implementations inside virtual reality or augmented reality using the tool of haptics, and also gaining business sense out of that.
Awesome. Sweet. So great intros, guys. That was fantastic. I think to kick things off, I'd love to start at a high level before we dive in a bit deeper. For people that maybe don't know a lot about XR, maybe they don't have a lot of experience in it, I'd love to get someone's take on just, a high level of what XR is and kind of why this area is important. How about Chris? Let me throw you into that one.
Sure. I mean, XR is this, I think hopefully as everyone knows, XR is a kind of a variable name in the sense that X can refer to a variety of different things. I think when we first started thinking about the book, we were thinking about VR primarily, but it turns out that a lot of the concepts, integration techniques, effect design principles, a lot of those things cover or should carry over, and also do carry over in certain situations directly to things like AR and MR. And so our idea was, well, let's just capture the whole thing as much as we can, but to sort of zoom out to what you're trying to get at is XR, from the purposes of this book, is really extended reality, and it refers to the artificial generation or synthesis of tactile sensations, either in a virtual environment or in a mixed reality environment. That's the context within which we're operating. And we're coming at it primarily, I think, as Gijs said, from a practical implementation-oriented perspective. So how do you actually make it work? What are the tools and techniques to make that happen?
Brilliant. Does anyone want to jump on that, add any pepper, any other context use cases?
One context that is very crucial in here is also the 3D component. So every interaction that we describe is a 3D interaction. So it's not a screen-based interaction, but it's always a 3D digital interaction that we're talking about.
Yeah, building on that is, you can see that as spatial computing. So from a tactile perspective, there is no, say, different from between MR and VR, right? So it's the same because you don't have this concept. And we approach the problem in a general manner, and that XR for us is spatial computing. So everything that is defined as space, basically. Could be then that is fiber tactile, but everything is defined in space, both interaction and feedbacks.
Awesome. how about use cases? So folks can kind of like wrap their heads around some of the key areas. So we've talked about gloves, the classic Chris's. That was a dream, as all of us growing up for sure. What are some of the use cases that we can just kind of like pepper, so folks have a better understanding of what things they should think about as we're talking? Eric, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So the book is divided in two parts. So there is a first part, which is a practical implementation strategy for haptics in XR, which is absolutely generic, and there is it's not tailored for any use case. It's really how would you approach the problem of implementing haptics, and what is the thought process that you should follow to manage times, cost, and pose yourself the question at the right moment and take the right decision at the right moment. Simply because putting the wrong haptics technology into a content can be destructive from an economical perspective, cost a ton of money for technology reasons. Then there is a second part, which is just use cases and just application area of haptics. In that case, we focused on where haptics has tangible use cases in XR today, which is enterprise VR. Not because gaming is not true, gaming is true, but it's just unclear the economical viability of these use cases at the time being. So at that stage, we focus on application areas where we have high-level virtual training, marketing, AR, simulation, and others. So there are multiple application areas with a discussion on technology options, as well cost, as well as why haptics make sense in that application. Then we have a second part of these use cases where we go in practice, discuss specific use cases that come from companies and has been implemented, and we discuss the value of haptics. Here we have feedback use cases from Haptics with Joe Michaels that's here, from Senseglove, from us, from several other companies, and also from Actronika and other external company that contributed with practical use cases defining why haptics is there, and we also discussed about the level of implementation that has been used. It means, is this a prototype? Is this in production? Is this scaling? Is where is the bar, right? And the reason by which we focalize on enterprise VR for that stage is that when we started the book, that was where haptics was. Maybe right now it's more gaming, but where haptics was, and also because the cost of haptics device right now is low compared to the CyberGrasp, but is still enterprise level. So this is, I think, the recap. Happy to other authors to jump in.
And also in this, in these examples, in these industry use cases, we touched a whole range from like low-end haptics, which start with hand interactions, to high-end haptics, like, for instance, devices such as the Haptics gloves. So yeah, both on use cases we differ, but also on fidelity of haptics. There's a lot of variety that we discuss, and also when you actually need to, or when it makes sense to implement a certain fidelity of haptics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that I think if there's no other value for this book, it's to demystify the economic decision, and you know. I don't want to. I actually want to stop talking about CyberGrasp if at all possible, but I'll use one more example. Is, you know, the device is really cool looking, but the fidelity of it is quite limited, right? And this is, I think I would invoke, you know, others who have indicated that there's a misunderstanding often between non-haptics people and haptics people around what exactly haptics can do. And so one of the key values of this book is very clearly articulating how you should think about from a user or customer or end user value perspective what they should expect to get from haptics, and make sure you make the right design decisions in terms of hardware and interactions and so on to get you to that point. And in fact, we make a point of saying one of the best haptic interactions you can possibly create is a passive haptic prop, right? Is just something that has the same basic shape as what you're trying to train or simulate, that has no other active functionality, right? That's the cheapest and most effective way to get high quality haptics. And we just need to incorporate that into our thinking so that we don't get carried away with a technology solution for a problem that's really more easily solved with an injection molded piece of plastic, right? And I think in our applications and use cases, we make a point of identifying where those decisions are appropriate and where they have been made and shown to be effective in practice.
I would just add on top of that I'm the person that works best with examples. So whatever, there's a workflow described with a lot of details, but once we have the example, so the actual implementation of that workflow, sometimes it's just speaking more to people who work that way. And we have a bunch of these so that we can actually understand what is the difference between different haptic objectives and how to implement them. So I think this is the like, at least I'm working, my brain works that way, and so it's very helpful to once you get that theory, you can just see the actual use cases implemented, existing, and see how this works with the workflow described before.
Yeah, and the book really take you indeed in a step-by-step approach. So we take you through all the first theoretical chapters, and also show you how to implement that into a virtual reality training scenario in this case. And then afterwards we talk about all different scenarios that are possible. So it's really in step-by-step guideline to implement haptics.
And I would just add on top of that, from my experience today, as Actronika we don't limit our activity to only the XR. And we actually started using the same approach to all other applications, because the definition of objectives, when talking to a client who doesn't necessarily knows what he wants, well, he can express his need, but to put it in the words that can be transferred to someone, read it on a piece of paper, it's always difficult. And this is definitely a way of thinking about these very abstract, sometimes very abstract concepts, and put the right vocabulary around these. These books will help a lot with that.
So basically, you are telling me that we can rebrand this book and sell it with another title and it would work, right?
Definitely.
We can sell it twice.
That's something that I was thinking, because XR is such a large spectrum, like Chris was saying, that it actually tackles many other industries that are more known to be haptics friendly. And I think people, like you said, will love this book for the live examples, the interactions, the taxonomy, everything that actually demystify those big terms.
Maybe make a comment on this. So what we found, we thought that it was a lot of work of assembling of existing things into a structured manner. So what we thought while starting this implementation guide is that we could have found a way to describe, small bits described here and there, or illustration described here and there, and assemble them together and make references. But what we found out is that these things didn't exist, really. So the approach that we did is that we did a lot of interviews. We interviewed a ton of people, and we put together our experience, and we had basically to write down quite a lot of these principles from an author and first principle perspective. And we had to do a lot of taxonomy and a lot of original illustration, because they simply were not around. And what we realized is that it was knowledge among experts, but it was impossible for anybody else to access this knowledge besides talking to these experts. So I think it took a bit more time than what we thought, because we basically had to, almost every word that is written there, that is not a use case, or comes from an interview, or comes from experience, and there is really little of rewashed content, let's say. So I think this is it was a good exercise, and I think it would be a refresher read from a reader on this topic, because we tried not to. We didn't find a lot of info, and we tried not to remesh what it was around there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the areas of haptics that can be very frustrating, is like where to find the right information without having to deep dive into become like an expert in many different areas. So that's really exciting. It's kind of just like a way to encompass a lot of the questions people have. In terms of the audience, of the people that should read this, what types of roles or even industries are you aiming this book at? Because there's a lot of folks in this room with different roles: marketing, CTOs, CEOs. What do you guys recommend? Who needs to read this?
I think there's two distinct types of people that should absolutely look at this book. And it kind of goes back to Eric's comment about the sections. The second half of the book is really a collection of application areas and use cases, as we described, but also a completely worked case study from sort of beginning to end of how the proposed ideas in the book would work in practice. And I think for the perspective of a program manager, project manager, or someone who's responsible for client satisfaction, or ultimately some product release or something like that, the decisions that they have to make about costs and trade-offs and so on, it's critical for them to understand the context within which this has been done successfully, and what were the trade-offs that were made to make that happen in those different application areas. That's sort of the first group, and that was the original idea that when we first started talking about this over a year ago. But then it turns out that there's a kind of a gap, I think, as everyone's articulating, between, okay, now we've agreed on what we want to build. There's a gap between that and the practical know-how to actually go ahead and implement it by assembling a bunch of different pieces. And the problem always with haptics is you have hardware, software, effect design, interaction design, and then it has to marry nicely with visual and audio, and then people have to be happy at the end, right? And so all those things don't always work out well, or have to be, carefully considered. And what we've tried to do is not take an academic approach at all, and not say, oh, well, this thing has this constraint or whatnot, or here's the psychophysical research on this. What we tried to do was say, here's our practical experience for how to make it work, and what are the tools you need to use, and how can you get this to a place where it's a satisfactory conclusion. Sorry, my coffee machine is in the background here. That part of the book is really focused on the person who's been given the PRD and said, go build this. Given the requirements, how am I actually going to go from the ideas on paper to something that's prototyped and working, and how can I test that and make sure that the end users are happy with it? So, obviously there's more detail that you can go into kind of in each of those areas from a technical perspective, but we tried to give you the basic framework that you would need to do to get going and get something working so that you can then iterate and refine.
Awesome. That's super helpful for anyone listening who is in charge of those areas and knows how difficult they can be to get started, to have the right frame of mind. So that's perfect. In terms of how this book maybe compares to some of the other literature out there, we've all have Audible books, have had to, clunk down research books. How does this kind of compare to what's existing on the market? Oh, Eric, you're nodding. If you want to go first.
Yeah. So I spend my bunch of time on reading academic book on haptics, and I rejoin what Chris was mentioning before. Most of the haptics book, at least to my knowledge, are great books, and they take haptics from a science perspective. They explain you what's mechanoreceptor, what's this, what's that, and the technology ones are extremely thorough about control systems, about actuator system, about mechanical response. And they are great because they give you an input on something that you should do yourself, right? But the things that we feel that this book builds on, it builds on top of that. It means that is an input information for what this book allows you to do, which is taking the information that is in the book, if you are don't want to be a specialist, or if you're a specialist, the information that are in that book over there, and allows you to merge them together and allows you to make informed decision onto how to implement then a haptic experience. In this case, it's an XR experience. So I think we have in one side the academic haptics book, which manage how haptics is from a technological perspective. In another way, you have XR implementation books that they exist, because that's a growing industry and there's quite a lot of books about how to implement effectively XR experience. And this book sits in between, so it allows you to tie the concept that you know from XR and the concept that comes from these academic books of haptics, or the information that are within the books, because it's a self-reference book, so you can use that alone without knowing all the rest, and allows you to merge them in an intelligent way. So we have a full chapter on multisensory with haptics and how to manage haptics in a multisensory environment, which answer the question on how do I merge all these great haptics objectives that I have with the 3D visual and audio environment. What are the rules there, which are not trivial at all, because you usually spend 2 years doing that and you realize what is wrong and what is good, and there was not a piece of paper that tells you what you should do actually. So I think it's really in between the XR implementation book and all the guides that exist for XR, that are a lot, that are great, which we don't talk about the visual aspects beside the one that is relevant for haptics, and the academic books on haptics, which are known to be thick, harder to digest, and specifically really focused on control and mechanical technology or on haptics perception. So I think this ties these two things together. At least that's my understanding.
Awesome, love that. Do you think that a book is the kind of perfect form for learning this kind of thing? It's kind of like a cheeky question. Are there other forms that we could use in the future that may be like better for teaching haptics? Video, audio? Just curious. Being cheeky.
Well, I do think this book is a very practical implementation guideline, and the book lets you cover both theory and implementation practice. You could split things if you would only look at implementation guidelines. One could make a tutorial, one could make maybe a video explanation of how, for instance, a XR haptic use case is created. But to bind the two together, I think the book is indeed the perfect form to learn about it. And maybe it can in the future be enhanced with more tutorial-wise case studies. But we have something to do there as well.
Oh, okay.
I think you could create a nice course, like an online course with this book that had worked examples and activities that people could do on their own to make sure they have a good understanding. The problem always with haptics is the hardware availability, right? And so the challenge with a different medium is how do you enable users or consumers of the information to really get that practical know-how, right? And so maybe Senseglove can offer a discount.
You can for sure always access our open source SDK for to learn about, for instance, the implementations that you can do. But
even something like a Meta headset or an HTC system, the haptics they're fine. They're not zero. You have some meaningful amount of control, and so at least for understanding the concepts related to multimodality and interactions that utilize haptics, those are important devices to consider. Not least of which is because in many applications that have a scale out component to them, those would be logical targets to scale out a haptic experience to. So you might have a multi-level thing where you have a Senseglove for like a small number of users, and then hundreds to thousands of users using commodity devices. And so what is the difference in haptic design implementation between those two? That's something that we talk about in the book in terms of how you should think about the primitives and their mapping. And so I think that could be an interesting way forward.
Yeah. Sorry, go.
And also referring back to the course part that Chris mentioned, for students who would like to also get some of these implementations. So for instance, one of our very happy guests in our Haptics Club is Lucas from Lucas VR. He created a $22 force feedback glove. So these same implementations that we describe in the book would also work for implementing a device like that. So those tools, those are open source tools, are perfect starting peripherals to also start implementing the mechanics that we describe in the book for students, for instance.
Yeah, it is true. And building on what Chris was mentioning is that with a low fidelity haptics device like the one that you find in Oculus and Vive controller, your ability to get a grasp on the concept that the book shares are there, but you actually cannot really refine that because the expressivity of this device is quite limited. This is my point of view from a practical experience. I think this might change maybe with the new PSVR 2 because you will have access to the great haptics interface, and that will be a fantastic haptic interface because it's a multi-perception and have both force feedback and wideband vibrotactile, and you can do really a lot of stuff. Of course, it's PlayStation, so that you need to be PlayStation partner to use that. So it's always the same problem, or you need to hack it, but that shouldn't be said. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a real challenge in haptics, and I won't hide it, is that access to an expressive haptics device for the people to iterate on that. And that is true, and that doesn't need to be hide. And I think there are other people working on that. There is Thomas Muller from Haptics Lab, and maybe one day there will be a really nice developer kit for haptics, and it's a wideband, and people can just use it and take it and put it somewhere. There is Actronika's kit for universities, but it's still for universities. It's not like $5 thing. You can buy. You can use your headphones to do stuff with spatial audio if you want, right? So we are not yet there with haptics, and I think that's a good challenge to tackle if someone wants to tackle it. This is, I think, one of the few friction that an implementer should actually consider, is that to implement this, you need you can start with standard haptics devices, but it's limited amount of things what you can do, but because it's limited the hardware. And if you want to iterate and get a grasp on that, probably the hardware part is the little problem that you need to solve.
Yeah, in fact, we actually, I think this will be interesting for this audience. We actually in the book say, as a user of haptic devices to build a XR experience, you should be putting the burden on the vendors of the devices and the hardware to prove to you that they have a sufficiently sophisticated SDK to make your life easy, right? And so this is a bit of a challenge that we're throwing down to the ecosystem, which is, it's very balkanized, very fragmented, and it's hard for people who are not experts to make decisions. That needs to change in order for this ecosystem to get to a place of growth. And so we're just in the book, we're reinforcing that point that it's, you can't ask the user to be an expert in haptics, but they still should be able to implement some decent experiences.
That's a really good insight. Absolutely. I'm actually kind of curious for each of you, what insight or interesting thing came about from either interviewing folks, just kind of putting the book together and seeing everything laid down. What kind of stood out to you as like something that was like surprising, shocking, exciting, or interesting that even your years of experience, it just kind of blew you away? Just kind of curious. Rafael, what stood for you?
I think from the interviews I did myself, the most surprising was the workflow. Actually, the workflow we are proposing is sort of a waterfall approach, and this was a lot of challenge. There was a lot of challenges from the research people about that approach. Where this was one of the, I think one of the advantages of that book is that practicality of the approach, that we at the end we cannot iterate infinite number of times, and this is sometimes the research overall goal is to just make it the perfect possible, and at some point when you think about industrial applications, you have to know where to say stop and if the objective was achieved or not. So this was, to me, this was one of the, I wouldn't say surprises, but I this was a bit of a struggle between keeping the ideas the way it was put it in the book, and try to find that compromise between all the people we talk to. They are really very well known names in that area, and we struggle a bit not to get to implement that knowledge from them, but still keep the core idea of the practicality of the book. So this was one of the point that I found extremely interesting, and I learned something from that. Yeah.
I love that so much. How about you, Gijs?
Yeah, I come from a whole different point of view because, well, obviously, all Eric, Rafael, and Chris are very experienced hapticians, let's say it that way, compared to the experience, well, the small 5-year experience that I have in haptics. So I came more from a more practical background, and to me, writing the book, everything fell in place. Like every theory that I was reading in the normal, like haptic academic literature, didn't really make a lot of sense to me as separate components. And we always had at Senseglove the way how we implement XR projects with our devices. And I kind of was stubborn also in this group, like, hey, this is how we do it. This is how the implementation works all the time. And then, yeah, from the implementation that I was experiencing, I could kind of connect the dots of the theoretical framework behind it. And that's also really nicely reflected in the book. So the first 5 chapters reflect in the way of working that we propose in the end. So that was really an eye-opener. And I actually learned a lot from, to connect the academic dots that I was missing personally, working on this book together with Chris, Rafal, and Eric.
How about you, Chris?
Yeah, so I think the thing that was surprising to me, this is going to sound like a slightly strange comment, but the thing that surprised me about the book, actually about the project, was, it was done in the context of Haptics Industry Forum in a working group that we, sort of Eric and I were talking about a long time ago. We created this thing. So Haptics Industry Forum is something we just invented. People started attracting themselves to it, and then we created this working group to talk about XR. We got Rafal and Gijs involved. And originally the idea was, let's just make a white paper or something that talks about this topic. But it surprised me how everyone was able to commit time and effort to get to a good result, and how the book, not that it wrote itself, but it kind of made a lot of sense once you started structuring it in that fashion. And it became clear that there was an opportunity to present this to the market, particularly from the interviews. It was like, one of the interviews I did was with a Dr. Okamura at Stanford, and she was remarking how when she got new PhD students, sometimes they were interested in working in haptics, but there was thousands of pages of literature for them to get up to speed on before they could do anything meaningful. And so she was like, a book like this would be great because it's a quick and dirty way to get going. And so for me, the naturalness of it that I think Gijs was identifying, it surprised me, and the fact that it was a natural product of this activity inside Haptics Industry Forum, it seemed like not predestined, but it seemed like one of those things that, it just worked out in a way that had it kind of needed to exist, I would say.
That's a fun way to say. I agree. It kind of needed to exist, and yeah. I agree, and from my perspective, one of the things that was not surprising, but was an eye-opener, it was this tension between the engineering approach and the designer approach, because haptics is a system-level property, right? So you have to work all together. So if you are experienced in that and you know what you're doing, you basically don't even almost have to iterate. You know exactly where you are going, but because you consider through experience everything, right? However, if you need to implement a purely designer approach that you have to iterate fast to arrive to the final results, sadly in haptics this is not yet possible. So you would take a lot of times, right? Just through sheer iteration. And we started, I think, from a purely engineering perspective. Our first waterfall was like how, from a haptic expert, I would approach this problem from a logical perspective. And then through, let's say, sheer interview and understanding of a designer mind from someone that is not experienced, we were able, I think, to find a nice balance between someone that is a designer that approaches this through a designer approach. That needs to be a structured thinking, but it still allows for this discovery and iteration, specifically for the final user experience, and someone that is coming from an engineering background that understands why you're doing that choices at that stage, let's say. So I think for me it was like, we started really from probably a too much engineering approach or haptic expert approach, and step by step through interviews and through discussing with the nice reviewers like Manu, you gave us a lot of feedback. There is Fabian from Interdigital gave a fantastic review of the book, as well as Dave Birman. And also all the interview with Ed Colgate, like I remember the interview, he basically took our approach and said, no, this is not how we should do that. Yes, I understand that you shouldn't, but we need to give a practical guide to guys. So we were able to drag it and allow to extract from this interview practical tips that needed to be there from a designer perspective, but also giving a framework of thought that allows you to quick and dirty in one way, or actually executing and give you a timeline for haptics. Because the feedback from the researcher is, no, you have to test it. Yeah, but I need to deliver in 1 month what I can do. That's the tension, and I feel that we found the right balance. That was, I think, really, from my perspective, really great.
That's awesome. It sounds like from the interviews that you guys did, you could probably write another book with some of those tidbits and insights. That's awesome. I just wanted to kind of ask one more question and just reiterate. So XR Haptics, Implementation and Design Guidelines is the title. It's available now on Amazon, and folks can kind of get it pretty much everywhere, I think, around the world. Where do the proceeds for this book go?
Not to us. So they go to the Haptic Industry Forum Association. So it's published by the HIF, and all the proceeds goes to HIF. So it goes to found the association, which is a non-profit association, by the way. And so everyone is invited to join, by the way, and everything goes there. And so we did it purely for documentation purposes, this book, and sustain the association.
Well. Time flies, and we already arrived at the 30-minute mark, which means that we are stopping the audio recording, and it's time to open the floor for audience questions. And for anyone listening to our podcast right now, you're missing out on the Q&A portion, so be sure to join us at the next event. Haptics Clubs happens every other week at the same day and time. And just a quick reminder that you can also stay on top of our next guest announcements on Twitter at Haptics Club. Our newsletter is in the bio, and our brand new website, thehapticsclub.com, so you can stay on top of our latest episodes. So catch the podcast on every major platform like Apple and Spotify, and we'll see you on the next episode. And to our listeners, if you have a question, please request to speak and we'll bring you up on stage.